What up, YouTube? Back with another video. I got a video. We're going to talk about how did Europe become mostly white or Caucasian. Now, if you're new to this channel, we talk about true history. We talk about the true origins of places. And one thing about Europe that's not really taught is that the original Europeans were so-called black people, what we would call black, what the old people would call swarthy or tawny. They were brown-skinned people. And the elites, the monarchies of that time, they were consistent of so-called black people. So it wasn't until recently, in the last few hundred years, that Europe became mostly a Caucasian dominated area. But even up to the late 1700s, Benjamin Franklin will even contested this. He said in his article about the swarthy Germans that Germany and Italy and Spain and France and the Netherlands, they were mostly consisted of swarthy people, what means brown skinned people. So how did Europe become white? This article is going to address a lot of the questions to that. So let's go. So why did medieval slave traders go to Finland? The demand for blonde girls and boys was so lucrative that slave traders would hunt for these people as far away as northern Finland, a recent study finds. Like other luxury items, these slaves would be worth the cost of transporting them to faraway markets in Asia and the Mediterranean. The article, The Baltic Finnic People in the Medieval and Pre-Modern Eastern European Slave Trade by Professor Jukka Korpela of University of Eastern Finland appears in the latest issue of the journal Russian History. Using chronicles, travelogues, and various administrative documents such as tax and land registers, as well as diplomatic reports, he found that there was an extensive raiding in parts of Finland, the Russian Karelia, and the Baltic countries during the late medieval and early modern periods, with thousands of persons kidnapped in the north. Only a fraction of them ended up in the Caspian Sea region in Central Asia via the Volgan and Crimean slave markets. See, the slave markets, they were in Central Asia and the Volga. That's where the Caucasian mountains are. So like Turkestan, Uzbekistan, that's where that was. That's so, the Slavs, the Eastern European Slav was synonymous with slave. So that's why, in medieval time, the white person was actually considered a slave, the Slav. But that was a medieval term. All right. So that these women, they were brought, or these, blonde hair boys and girls, they were brought to the Volga region. All right. And otherwise, slave trade in Crimea and Volga regions was extensive, and tens of thousands of people were sold into slavery every year. However, the existence of the trade route shows that it was possible, even under primitive conditions, to distribute information about the demand for blonde girls in the faraway markets. The network of those involved in slave trade include men who were participating in raids, slave traders, and customers representing the elite class of society. Raids into the north were launched especially from Novgorod, which was well connected to the Crimea, and thereon to the Caspian Sea and the slave markets of Central Asia. Raids were done by private warlords, princely troops, and they extended all the way to the coast of the Gulf of Bothnia and Lapland. For example, Korpela writes how the Novgorodian warlord Prokopy conquered the town of Kostroma in 1375, imprisoned many local men, women, and girls, continued his raid along the Kama and Volga to the town of Bulgar, where the party sold all their Christian prisoners, young girls and women, to Muslim traders. Finally, the gang proceeded to Astrakhan, where they were executed, obviously as bandits, by Khan Sachet. Finns were especially valuable on the slave trade market because they were neither Christian or Muslim, and because of their light skin color, Corpella explains. The most expensive slave in the Kappa register was a 14-year-old white boy referred to in the source text as Jarcaxius or Circassian, who was sold for 750 aspers, and there were other slaves with good color qualifications that seemed to carry an above average price. One 4.5-year-old Russian white boy, quote unquote white boy, cost 185 aspers. Although such young children were usually very cheap on account of their high mortality rate, White, quote unquote, Saracen slaves were also overpriced in the Genoese registers, and blonde boys and girls were expensive on the Italian markets too. When they say Saracen, that's like the people of Arabia, like the Arabian Desert over there, what we call the modern day Middle East. That's what it means, Saracen. So these white people, Saracen slaves were expensive too. They wanted these blonde haired people in this area. The slave trade in Eastern Europe gradually faded as the control exercised by the emerging structure of the European states became stronger. The spreading of Christianity also caused a decline in slave trade during the medieval period. Slave trade within Europe declined already in the early medieval period, but in regions bordering on Islamic countries, slave trade continued up until pre-modern period. All right. So now I'm going to kind of give a little bit more context to that story, because it wasn't just they were going just to like Finland and Scandinavia. All right. So this is a book from Ivan van Sertima called African Presence in Early Europe. And it's very good because he's talking about a lot of history in regards to, so-called Black people in Europe. Of course, Ivan Sertima, he's a Afrocentrist, so he believes that every quote unquote Black person in any part of the world all came from Africa. So he just attributes that to Africa. But we know that every indigenous place has what we call Black people, brown skinned people. All right, so let's go. So he quoted this from W.E.B. Du Bois. We're going to start the second paragraph on the screen. As may be expected, W.E.B. Du Bois makes some interesting points regarding the use of the word quote unquote Arab, having noted that many Arabs are quote unquote dark skinned, sometimes practically Black, often having Negroid features and hair that may be Negro in quality. All right. Du Bois reasoned that the Arabs were too nearly akin to Negroes to draw an absolute color line. And finally, Du Bois concludes that the expression Arab has evolved into a definition as more religious than racial. The term Arab is applied to any people professing Islam. Much race mixing has occurred so that while the term has a cultural value, it is a little ethnic significance and is often misleading. So at the time, in the before the 1100s, in the middle age period, medieval period, Arab was synonymous with Black. Arab was synonymous with Negro, really synonymous with Moor. They all meant the same thing. But now, with a lot of the racial mixing, you just kind of consider Arab like a DJ Khaled type person. Like you see that type of person when you think of Arab. But at that time, in the medieval period, it was synonymous with Black. So this would make sense into why the slave traders, they wanted these blonde hair, fair skin, especially young girls. So this is going into the chapter. This is, I think, like 161 page into the book. They're going to start at the top. So with contributions of individuals such as Zaryab, Spain flourished, but amidst the beauty and wealth, a social political plague was spreading. Jews who had been slaves now began trading in slaves. So the Jews, they were oppressed. Now they're one of the top leaders of Europe at the time with the Moors, right? Because the Moors and the Jews, they had a co-reigning kingship in Europe, especially in the, from the about 500 AD to about 1300 AD. So the Jews who had been slaves now began trading in slaves. According to T.B. Irving, between the years 786 to 1009, Franks and Jews traded Slavs and Germans who had been taken prisoner on the Frankish territories. That's like French all the way to Germany. Thus, Slav and slave became interchangeably terms. So Slav and slave was interchangeable. That's why it's like the Caucasian was initially the slave of Europe. It's only recent history they equate Black with slave, but at that time, Caucasian was actually seen as slaves, and they didn't call themselves Caucasian; they called them Slavs. All right, or the Eastern European. All right, so the Franks and Jews made young boys into eunuchs at Verdun. If a eunuch is a man that was castrated, they removed his scrotum, and they nipped his privates. All right. The slaves were driven from France to Spain in great herds like cattle. When they reached their destination, the men were purchased as servants or laborers. the women as household help or concubines. Many women were also imported from Galatia, for their blonde appearance attracted the Arab gentlemen. Slaves were also traded from the Adriatic. These captives too were Slavs, and their merchants chiefly Christians. And when they say Christian, they talk about the so-called blacks that rule Europe. And so you see that they wanted these blonde hair women. That's why, that started to change the racial makeup of Europe. You started to have more of a lighter skin tone to a lot of the Europeans at that time, even up to today. It's a lot of different Europeans. If you go to, see a European in Britain, looks a little different from the one in Ireland, looks a little different from the one in Germany, looks a little different from the one in Portugal, looks a little different from the one from Greece, because they all had different racial makeup from the people who were indigenous to those lands. And what the original people were so-called black people. That's why Europeans all look kind of different. All right. So this slave trade changed the racial mix in Al-Andalus. The use of European women as concubines gradually lightened the complexion of Moorish Spain. Through these various processes, Moorish Spain became more Caucasian in blood than is generally realized. It was always blonde women, whether Slavs, Germans, or Galatians, who were in special demand. So again, this is just showing more emphasis in the article that we read. Why the Europeans, why the Arab slave traders, they all wanted these blonde haired women. And that over, of course, this is, from 786 to 1009, almost 300 years of just, interbreeding. Eventually your population is going to change. It's going to look a certain way, so that's why Europe, they had different types of skin tones. Some of them were dark skin, some of them were lighter skin, some had a complexion of a Steph Curry, some had the complexion of a Sinbad, or Red Fox, a very light-skinned man, that black man that we would say is red bone or light skin, but they had they could pass for that Caucasian look, especially if you're painting them. So that's why a lot of the images look the way they do. So I just want to provide a little context to what we talk about with the European history.